Welcome back once again to Simple Truths with the Bald Man. Uh, one more time, I am your host, Pastor Jared, and uh, and this week I think we're going to go back to the science conversation because we kind of walked away from it for a little bit, and uh, and hopefully it was intriguing to somebody. Certainly is to me. I'm gonna stop and apologize now because I don't know if you can see it on camera or not, but I'm absolutely covered in dog hair. And we had a pretty good storm here today, and turns out that I have a big 60 plus pound dog that turns into a complete lapdog chicken when the thunder hits, and so I've been covered in mutt all day. Uh, anyway, you probably can't even see it on the camera, but I feel it. So going back, we have talked twice before about science and specifically about the sciences that seek to disprove God or to at least cast a very serious doubt on on a creator, on the story of the Bible, and and in that general direction. So in the first video, we talked about what exactly a scientific theory is and how you arrive at that, and not that the system is always corrupted, but how it is very easily corruptible system, and just understanding that any human system is corruptible, and it doesn't really matter how idiot proof it is or uh, how safety conscious it is, whatever. There's always a way to corrupt anything human, and and in this case, it's not really even difficult. Um, Second video, we talked about timelines, and we started to get into the idea of old Earth, new Earth, or old Earth, young Earth, and and talked about dinosaurs and man sharing the Earth and being on Earth at the same time, living in the same eras. The fact that most science says that that didn't happen, that there's a 50 some million year gap between the death of the dinosaurs and the arrival of mankind. And yet, archaeology, cave drawings, carvings, the artwork from ancient peoples from before dinosaurs were discovered have representations of things that look very suspiciously like dinosaurs. So it just becomes very questionable, if the dinosaurs died and were gone and man didn't find them, dinosaurs died here, man found the dinosaurs here, how are they back in this area, drawing drawings of them and knowing anything about them. So that's kind of what we talked about in that one. Definitely a lot more in depth, so please check it out if you haven't. And then, of course, the old Earth, new Earth thing. So if you're not familiar with this, if you don't, if that terminology itself doesn't tell you, essentially there are two camps, and even not even all Christians believe in a young Earth theory, but there's two camps. There are those who believe that the Earth is, somewhere around 64 billion years old, and that it formed over billions of years and took a long time for everything on the earth and life and everything to develop into what it is now. And then there's the camp that believes that the earth is between 6 and 10,000 years old, that it was created in a literal time frame per the creation story in the Bible, that the 7 days were 7 literal days, and that all of the 64 billion year narrative is false, and that is really my lean on it, and I explained some of that in the last video. I'm going to explain some of that in this video, and try to help people understand why I don't believe it. And the simple question of age of the Earth itself, I don't know is anything that would be a salvation issue. I don't think it's anything that if a Christian believed in a 64 billion year old Earth, depending on the details and whatnot, I don't know that it's anything that's going to keep you out of heaven. But to me, the whole reason I'm doing a program called Simple Truths is because I believe that we are given a lot of information that is stated pretty simply, that's given to us in a straightforward manner by a creator who wanted us to know him, that wanted us to be able to look to him and say, I understand this. And so we're told things in simple manner that we then turn into a poetic or a metaphorical kind of a thing so that we can make our views and popular world views fit together. And I think we convolute things. I think that we just way overcomplicate things that are not that complicated. And in turn, we change meanings of things and really just lose the truth of things because we're trying so hard to take two different positions and make them fit together and to figure out, how can we, and I think a lot of that has to do with pride. A lot of that has to do with, I'm a Christian, but there's this whole world out there of non-Christians who think that our beliefs are stupid. And, how can I show them that we really kind of believe the same things? In a lot of instances, we don't, and that's just something you're going to have to deal with. You're either going to have to, you're going to have to pick a side of the fence. You're going to have to be this person to believe, or you're going to have to be that person to believe. And I'm not trying to put all that weight on, young Earth, old Earth situation. I'm just saying that at some point, one of the arguments against Christianity, one of the arguments against a intelligent creator and all that, somewhere you're going to have to draw the line in the sand. If you're going to believe or if you're not going to believe, at some point you're going to have to draw that hard line in the sand and say, look, there's just, this is it. You cannot cross this line and expect me to go with you. That's just where it is. For me, one of those lines is, or part of that line is this. I do not believe that there's a 64 billion year history to Earth. I don't think that our universe has existed beyond 6,000 to 10,000 years. And I'm not gonna, I don't want to overcomplicate it. I want to give you some of the most common ways that science seeks to date things, that they seek to prove this long history and why I don't believe them. And then beyond that, if you want to do more research, if you want to go dig deeper and choose for yourself, do that. I always encourage that. I always encourage you to test what I'm telling you because it really doesn't matter how smart, educated, or whatever somebody is, if you don't know who they are, if you don't look for yourself, then you're really just trusting somebody that you don't know. You're putting your faith in somebody that you don't know, and I'm human. If you're going to put your faith in somebody without testing it, I'm not the guy. That's up to you and God. But the more that you double check what I'm telling you and see that even if you don't agree with it, see where I'm coming from and see that I'm giving you an honest assessment the way I see it, then the more you can trust me in the future, the more you can see the things that are going to come up later on that maybe you do actually question, that maybe you do actually need some guidance on. And at that point, you'll be a little more in a position to say, this guy hadn't lied to me before, at least not intentionally. He really believes what he's saying, so that gives me a good starting point to do some research on whatever other subject. I rambled a whole lot more than I intended to there, but that's the purpose. That's really the purpose of the whole show. But for today's information, and I warned you way back in the first video, I have a coffee habit, so Sorry, I have to deal with that. So for today, how does science support a 64 billion year old Earth? How do they point to that? How do they stand behind that? The most common uh, processes that you will hear are have to do with radiation and have to do with the layers of the Earth. And I hadn't really thought about doing anything with the layers of the Earth, so I'm just going to kind of cover it really quickly. Basically, the the idea is this: if you cut a cross section out of the Earth and pull it out in any given area, you're going to see this era of rock and then another era of rock and another and another and another, and they're going to have different fossils in them. And basically, what that is in year 64 billion BC, the first rocks settled and formed, and then whatever died in that time and got buried in those rocks was fossilized there. And then over time, another layer settled on top of that, and the beings of that time that died got fossilized in there. Then over time, another era settled over that, and we just keep packing on like rings in a tree. So basically, we dig all the way down to the molten center core of the Earth, or as close as we can, and we start seeing all these different layers that represent different time frames. That's the theory. And in each of those time frames, there should be unique um, fossils, things that existed in that time and not in another time. Now, there's some crossover, obviously, because maybe something survived in the end of this era and into this era, and that same life form can be found in both because it lived through that, maybe in multiple eras. The problem really is this: number one, the layers of the Earth is very easily explained, and even easier explained through a worldwide flood situation. 40 days of water permeating the entire planet and uprooting everything, all the rock and the dirt and the layers and all that stuff. And in that time, and turbulent. It wasn't just a drizzle of rain. It was torrential rain, flooded the entire Earth for 40 days, and then stayed on the Earth for longer than that. And I mean, it was almost a year, I want to say, in the Ark. Like I said, I didn't plan this part of it, so I'm not certain about that. But they were in the Ark for at least 6 months. So you've got the entire ground from the highest mountain to the lowest valley to the depths of the ocean, everything with this water and this turbulent storm activity that stirs everything up, and then over the next however many days while the water recedes, it all settles back down. Well, obviously, if you've ever done anything with water, if you've ever looked at anything like that, what's going to happen is this: the heavier, finer particles are going to settle first. They're going to go to the deepest part. And so you're going to have a layer of very fine, like silt is a good example. Very fine mud settles down at the very bottom, and then everything else packs on top of it. The next smaller particles, the next smaller, the next smaller. Same thing tends to happen with the beings. The smaller and denser a life form, the less buoyant a life form, the faster it's going to sink. The bigger something is, the more surface area it has, the more air it takes in its lungs or whatever. The bigger it is, the more it tends to float. And so what you get is this situation where over time, over the several days of the flood receding waters and all that stuff, you get the finer silt and the smaller things that start to pack in. And the bigger things are floating and moving. The bigger rocks and all that stuff are still moving. And over time, the different layers kind of settle in and the different beings kind of settle in. Now, at some point, those real big beings become completely saturated with water and they're no longer buoyant. So then they fall and they tend to pack in, and they tend to pack in, it's as we've seen through digging and through dinosaur digs. I can't think of the words I'm looking for. We tend to see them in groups. Um, so that kind of suggests that maybe they were all in groups in the first place, but I'm not real sure. I'm not going to offer a whole lot on that because I haven't researched it. But we do tend to see them in groups, large beings in one spot. But we also see the big oil reserves and things like that, which is very likely caused not only by the animals but by the plant life, and by a plant life that seems to be very different from what we see today, and therefore could have tangled those beings together as well and caused some of that. But that's a very quick, simplistic overview of how the flood could have easily created the layers of Earth situation that we see. Something else that happens is when you go to different areas, like the Grand Canyon versus, about 50 miles away from the Grand Canyon, and you dig, what you see is you have all the exact same layers, except one will be missing over here that is present here, or out of place. One of them is different over here than it is over here, and the chaos of the flood could explain that. The layers of Earth timeline doesn't. It doesn't work in that situation, and that's something that you just don't hear people talk about. So, moving off that and going back, because I'm already, over 15 minutes in, almost 17 minutes into this thing. The other major way that science supports an old Earth theory is through radiometric dating, carbon dating. And I'm sure you've heard at least one of those two terms at some point. So let's start with carbon dating. That is the most common term. Essentially, what you've got is this. There is a certain amount of carbon atoms in the atmosphere. Some of them are exposed to radiation from the sun, and they change, and they become carbon-14, which is a radioactive isotope that is in the atmosphere at all times, that we breathe in and breathe out, and it's constantly moving in and out of our bodies through our airways and such until we die. And when a living thing dies and stops breathing, then what is in their system becomes stagnant. It stays. We don't breathe it out anymore. We don't breathe it in anymore. So what we have at that moment of death is what we're going to keep. Now, radioactive material decays in what is called a half-life. So what that means is, if I've got, and these are very simple numbers, but if I've got 10 atoms of carbon-14 in my system when I die, then in a certain number of years, I think it's like 5,100 years or something, but I don't remember exactly. But in a prescribed number of years, half of those will die. I will now have 5 atoms, and the other 5 will have died and become something else. They will have decayed into a different material. Then in another 5,100 years, I'll have 2.5 atoms left, and the other 2.5 will have died and decayed and gone into something else. And that will continue until there's not enough left to measure. Now, carbon-14 dating, if it is accurate, only works up to about 50,000 years. And beyond that, anything that is subject to carbon-14 dating is too decayed and doesn't have enough of a carbon-14 footprint left to date it accurately beyond that, if it's correct. But here's the problem. The only way to determine how long ago something died based on carbon-14 is to see how much is there now, and then make an assumption as to how much carbon-14 was in that being when it died. You cannot know what it had in it at the time of death. Now, this was originally my answer to this was that you can't expect that the carbon-14 was static in the environment for all the billions of years that you assume through the formation of the atmosphere, and then the hole in the ozone layer and all this stuff. I mean, even now, you go from Aspen, Colorado, which is about 10,000, 11,000 feet elevation, to Midland, Texas, which is below sea level. And the amounts of oxygen, nitrogen, all of the essentials that we find in the air we breathe change. They change from this elevation to that elevation. But we're assuming that the carbon-14 doesn't. Really? I mean, things at moments, from moment to moment, our atmosphere is in a state of flux. It's always changing. You know, the weather affects it, the time of day, the elevation, all of that stuff affects it. And yet, we have to assume that carbon-14, this one specific isotope, never changes. Well, science figured out, you know, that's kind of a stupid idea. So then the only answer they have to that is, well, we have to assume that over time we can guess how much it's changed. And so they made a graph and they made a you know, something to figure that in and to try to add that to the equation in order to bolster the timelines and explain it a little deeper. Problem is, it's still an assumption. And if you really stop and step back from carbon-14 dating and you really look at it, if you are off by a small percentage, less than 10%, if you're assuming that there was this much carbon-14 in this being when it died, and you're off by less than 10%, that can change hundreds of thousands of years, depending on the sample size. You know, it can literally change the entire timeline by huge amounts. It's just it doesn't stand up. So then the other dating process is radiometric dating. It's essentially the same process, except it's built for rocks. And what it does is it does the same process, but with what they call parent and daughter materials. And hold on, I got to find my example here. One of them that I'm going to throw out there, and I think this, if I understand correctly, this is the most common one, is potassium argon dating. And what happens is the potassium in a rock is the radioactive material. It stands to be the, sorry, I got kind of lost on my notes here trying to figure stuff out. The potassium is the radioactive material. So when it decays and no longer has its radioactivity, it becomes this argon. And the argon is what's left. And so what somebody does is they pull a rock sample and they test the level of potassium in it, they test the level of argon in it, and then the assumption is made. All of this argon, once upon a time, was potassium. And so we know how long it takes potassium to decay. So by looking at this versus that, we can tell how long this rock has existed. The biggest problem here is not that you have to assume how much material is in the rock, because you know how much material is in the rock. The problem here is that the assumption is made that there was no argon in that rock when it was created. Argon is a naturally occurring element. It happens without the potassium being part of it. It happens spontaneously on its own as well. So what you're saying is this rock had zero argon in it when it was formed, and every bit of the argon that is there is a result of the decay of potassium. Here's the problem. There was an article that I came across once upon a time, and unfortunately I cannot find it anywhere now. I have looked and looked, and it is really like somebody made it disappear. Yes, I realize that sounds very conspiracy theory of me, and I have moments where I do kind of look at things from a conspiracy side, and I'm not necessarily doing that now. But I have looked everywhere I can for this article. I know that the article existed once upon a time. I personally read it. I personally saw the information in it, but I can't find it now. However, some of the information in it explained exactly what I'm talking about. Um, it explained that the anomalies were very likely from natural formation situations rather than from time and decay. It cited a live penguin. This is a penguin that is currently living, breathing at the time. Um, this penguin was living, breathing at the time it was tested, and yet the carbon 14 testing dated it several thousand years old. There was another animal, which I believe was a coyote, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm having trouble with it because, like I said, I can't find it. But it was a prey animal, or no, a predatory animal, pardon me. And it was dead, but they tested this dead animal. It was a fresh kill. It was freshly dead. They tested it. Carbon 14 tested it to be tens of thousands of years old, and they knew it was not. And and now, what a lot of people will talk about, and what you will find is there's examples of snails that test to be thousands of years old, mollusks, and underwater creatures. Now, this is something that science is not afraid to admit because they live underwater and things work differently, and there's just different processes. So you'll see how mollusks and all that stuff don't affect the timeline for carbon 14. What you won't see is this penguin they tested. That's not an underwater creature. This predatory coyote or whatever it was that they tested, not an underwater creature. These things lived in the same atmosphere that you and I do, but yet they tested thousands of years wrong. And then also in that article was cited a lava flow from a volcano. What happened was, and again, I'm kind of just estimating this stuff because I don't have the article in front of me, but what happened was this. Within 50 to 100 years prior to the test, volcano erupts, lava flow happens, and a new rock formation occurs. And this is documented. It's recent enough history that it's documented, and the dates that the lava flow occurred were recorded and solid. We knew exactly when they happened, without doubt. Then, fast forward 50 to 100 years, somebody takes a sample of those rocks and sends them blindly to be dated. And when I say blindly, I mean they did not give all the information to the site testing them. They just sent them rocks and said, we need to know how old these are. And I think they sent them to more than one different facility, and the facilities were well known, well recognized for their radiometric dating abilities. The rocks tested to be tens or hundreds of thousands of years old because of potassium argon dating, when in reality, the rocks were 50 to 100 years old. And the reason they tested so old is because in their formation, argon was present. Enough argon was present that it threw off the dating by thousands and tens of thousands and however many thousands of years. It threw it off exponentially to a ridiculous amount. But people will not, there's this scientific community that will not acknowledge that that's happening. They will not acknowledge that there are obvious flaws based on assumption in the dating processes that they use to date the Earth. And the biggest reason that I believe they can't do that is because as soon as they admit that, everything that they've built from their foundation of 64 billion years, evolution, no God, all of that stuff starts to crumble and fall apart. And that's why I don't believe in an old Earth situation, because there's just too much that cannot be reconciled. There's too many question marks that you can't cover, and assumptions that have to be made in order to make this stuff true that can very easily be bad assumptions and change the whole dating process by thousands, millions, billions of years. It's just that, it's that simple. If one rock from 100-year-old lava flow can be tens of thousands of years wrong, what happens when you come across a 10,000-year-old rock that you think happened to be the creation of the Earth 64 billion years ago? Is it possible that you're just misinterpreting and misreading the evidence? Yeah, absolutely it is. So that is where I'm at on this one, on old Earth, young Earth, on radiometric dating. I don't think it's a useful science. I don't think it's an accurate science. I think it is a control technique at best, and it is one of those things that people with big vocabularies have worded in a way and have just viciously fought for in such a way that they have beat down people who are opponents of it, and so that the common person out there who doesn't really want to research it is just convinced enough, this is way too complicated for me to understand, so I'm just going to take what they say as the law. And that is, I think, how most of this stuff happens. Evolution, time, age of the Earth, Big Bang, bunch of that stuff. It's all stuff that nobody can really replicate. Nobody saw, nobody was there except for God. And so nobody can really say this is what happened or this is what didn't happen. And yet they do, and they do so with such a vigor that people who don't want to take the time to research it eventually just kind of get to the point they're like, okay, whatever you say, man, you got it. This is what it is. And especially if that person wants a reason not to believe in God, well, then it becomes a very attractive explanation of things. So that's where we're at on this one. I think there's going to be one more video. It's going to be about evolution, so it may become two videos because I talk a lot, and that one definitely gets my attention. But I do have a couple of articles here just to cite some of the things so you can kind of flesh out what I've been saying and maybe look a little deeper and understand a little deeper if you want to. Um, Beyond that, and if you got questions, send them to me. I'm anxious to hear them. Questions about this, questions about other stuff, whatever. Write my programming. I'm not gonna quit asking you. So you might as well just send something in. You might as well give me some stuff to work with because I'm gonna keep bugging you for it. Even after you send it in, I'm gonna keep bugging you for it. But reach out. Love you guys. Can't wait to hear from you. Don't make me come start knocking on doors. I'll see you next time. Thanks.